Good afternoon and good day to you. This is Brandon Tilt here, and you're tuned into Feathered Light podcast, where I like to explore mental health related topics, sometimes about philosophy, sometimes about my personal experiences. And I want to jump into a topic that I'm quite sure isn't something I'm not an expert. In fact, it's kind of outside my scope of practice, but seeing as though this isn't a session, this is more of just a exploration. I want to just see how this topic lands, and it's the topic of neuroscience. It's the topic of the brain and the nervous system, and just a very, very deeply rich topic academically, but maybe a topic that's a little bit, misunderstood, or there's a lot of pop psychology out there, and a lot of simple, practical, conclusions about the body and about the nervous system and about the brain. And I think it's going to be important that I give a little bit of academic insight, because I have studied a little bit of neuropsychology. It's been a minute. It's been at least a few years probably, but I've been reviewing from my textbook here by Brian Kolb and Ian kʷikʷəḷł. It's called Fundamentals of Human Neuropsychology. And it's a great one to dive into. Very, very deeply academic. This is a third-year psychology course. It's not an easy read, but I just kind of skimmed some of the topics and jumped back to some of the rabbit holes that I'd gone down many years ago. And I'm also trying to make this casual. Here's the thing. I don't want to make this like Andrew Huberman style. I probably have 1/100th of his knowledge, or, maybe in 1/1000th of his experience in working with this stuff, because he's gone so deep, right? I'm just some guy, a counselor who's studied some of this stuff, engaged with it quite deeply and intimately. I have gone deep into some of these topics in terms of spending hours writing papers and making presentations and just kind of thinking about the concepts. So I've thought about these topics. It's not the first time I've looked at these things, but as you'll figure out from my reflections, this is a complex topic. But it's also rich, and it's also, I would say, very valuable if you're able to just have an open mind in terms of how does the brain and the nervous system come into the equation when you're doing what I'd consider the inner work or healing. So let's jump right in. I'm going to give us something of a map. So for those of you who are not familiar, we have a couple different types of nervous systems, a few actually, and I'm going to pull open the textbook to make sure I get these right. Flipping through pages. So our nervous system consists of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, CNS and PNS, those two big ones. All right. So the central nervous system consists of our brain and our spinal cord. Very simple. Many people actually probably know this, whether or not you study this stuff. Now, the peripheral nervous system actually consists of two separate nervous systems within it. One's called the somatic nervous system, which is interesting, is where we get this word somatic, meaning soma, meaning body, right? And the autonomic nervous system, which is not automatic, it's autonomic, which is a little bit different. But it's just interesting to start to notice there's a subdivision within the nervous system. And I suppose there is some value getting a little bit more specific, but just consider that there's the brain and the spine in one, and then there's this bridge of these muscles and tissue groups and all these different layers of functioning that operate continuously without our conscious awareness. And, muscle tissues, muscle cells, skin, all the different interminglings of what we consider the nervous system. Even the vagus nerve is probably more part of the central nervous system, actually, but you're just kind of considering that it's broken down into different branches. And You just want to be aware that the central nervous system is kind of I'd say our primary operating system we kind of control. And then the peripheral nervous system, what's going on in the periphery, right? It's going on continually. It's functioning in a way on its own, as much as we are in control of it. There's many aspects of it that are just automatically kind of playing out and sort of have been programmed through the central nervous system and are just kind of playing out, acting out commands in a way. So that's just a quick little introduction. I guess just to define the somatic nervous system, it is what consists of the spinal cranial nerves. So that would be what would house the, some people are aware, it's where polyvagal theory would be kind of linked to, is this somatic nervous system. The polyvagal system and the polyvagal nerves are all related to the spinal, nerves. So according to this, the SNS, the somatic nervous system, it transmits sensory information to the central nervous system, including vision, hearing, pain, temperature, touch, position, movement of body parts, produces movements in response. So the autonomic nervous system, the other one, the ANS, so there's somatic and the ANS, these are all part of the peripheral nervous system. These are going to be the rest and digest. So the rest and digest is really just meaning everything within the organs, everything that disengages and calms the nervous system. It's going to be related to the autonomic nervous system. But in addition to that, the ANS controls the opposite of that, which is the sympathetic arousing nerves. So there's the parasympathetic nerves within the autonomic nervous system. The parasympathetic is the rest and digest. It's chilling you out, right? Parasympathetic. It's engaging in this opposite of the sympathetic response. But the sympathetic, ironically named, aptly named, is actually what is engaging these fight or flight responses. It's getting you into what we refer in counseling as flooding. So if you think about the sympathetic nervous system, it's really what is engaging with flooding, hyperarousal. The parasympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic branch within the autonomic nervous system, it's what's engaging in the rest response. Maybe even is connected to disassociation in some way, because it's kind of they might be going to the extreme. I remember the sympathetic system being related, and even the parasympathetic, is because in the polyvagal theory, at the very top it's the ventral vagal, and then the middle it's the sympathetic, and then the bottom is the dorsal. So that's kind of another way of just sort of simplifying, is you got the nervous system, it's got the top spinal nerves, it's got the middle spinal nerves, and it's got the lower spinal nerves. And let's just leave it at that. There's a lot of different ways you can further complexify this. Just consider that when we're referring to the nervous system, many people are probably referring to either the central nervous system, which is the spine in itself, or the spinal nerves, which is the autonomic nervous system, and that's what's engaging in fight or flight or rest and digest. So that's the nervous system in a nutshell, if I didn't lose you already, which I might have. Additionally, it's important to recognize the brain. Now, when we think of the brain, many of us probably just through pop psychology are familiar with the frontal lobe, which is the prefrontal cortex. Generally speaking, it's just this area that takes a long time to develop, because when you're a teenager, it's not online yet, and it starts to come online, and it's more related to higher order thinking, and it's making rational, logical decisions based on long-term memory and learning things that you've learned over the years. So it's the last thing to come online. But in addition to the frontal lobes, we have the parietal lobe, which my understanding it's kind of next to, it's kind of around the sides. In the parietal lobe is related to spatial awareness, visualizations. Like if you're doing, let's say, a visualization meditation, your parietal lobes are engaged. And then the integration of spatial information. So it's really about taking what the body's saying and applying it into how you see things and move through the world. Not necessarily always related to visual, like using visual information, but it does incorporate it. And then, of course, the occipital lobe, many know, it's in the back of the brain, right above the brainstem. And it's could be related to visual processing or perception. So it's a very complex system. There's a lot of things related to what comes into account when we're looking at things and we're perceiving the world. And then lastly, the temporal lobe, which is kind of in the middle. It's more kind of like towards the middle, the center of the brain. It's towards the lower middle kind of chunk. And it's pretty close, actually. It's going to be connected to the limbic system, which is the amygdala, which we all think of as the almond-shaped little chunk of the brain, which is in the dead center, which is related to emotions. So the temporal lobe houses the limbic system, I believe, or it's connected very much to it. If not, it incorporates it. So it's about memory. It's going to be connected to memory, long-term memory, short-term memory. It's kind of where we see our personality being housed and understood. It's kind of activated when we consider where our personalities come into play and how they form. And then emotions. So that's the overall map, is the frontal lobe, higher order thinking in the front of the brain, motor control as well, right? And temporal lobe, a little bit lower than the frontal lobe, and it's kind of more central in the brain, and it's memory, personality, emotions. And then towards the back, very back, is the visual processing center, the occipital lobes, and then the parietal, which is, from understanding, more towards the top, but it's also on the left and right, and it kind of wraps around, and it's about spatial awareness, and it also looks to using that spatial information. So that's the brain in a nutshell. If you really want to get a good visual, I recommend just like looking it up, look up map of the brain, and you'll get a great visual with lots of colors. And that's just kind of like the quick and fast rundown. Is you have a brain, right? And you have a nervous system, and the brain is broken up into these 4 categories, which get a lot more specific the more you study this stuff. But just think of it like that. You got categories that are related to logical thinking. You got categories that are related to the processing of visual information. You got the other categories that are related to the application of that visual information. And then, of course, other memory based areas that deal with long-term memory, short-term memory, and emotions. It's all mapped accordingly. Apparently, this is something they say in the book, and I might be quoting this incorrectly, but all of our brain, all the cells, are essentially being mapped in relation to what we visually perceive. There's something there about the way the brain's organized based on the way our eyes originally recognize things, and there's kind of like a way to which things are being like mapped, and these cells are growing and structured in relation to visual information that we've received over our lives. So I think it's interesting to recognize what you're looking at and what you've looked at over the years has actually created this structure within your mind. So I want to kind of just chill for a moment. And, if you're feeling overwhelmed, I want to say good, but that's probably fair to say. This topic will, in a sense, some people, it just gets them so interested, so fascinated. It kind of like you can nerd out to the extreme about neuroscience forever, right? This isn't just neuroscience. This is neurobiology and neurophysiology. And the topic starts with the anatomy of the brain, right? But it starts to get into the cells, neurons they're called, and how they interact within themselves to create all these different substructures and sub relationships and flows of essentially neural activity. It gets complicated as fuck very, very quickly. And I'm kind of keeping us on the surface level, right? I'm throwing a bunch of information at you, some of which might just be review, but some of which might be new, and that's okay too. And I am going to bring this to a practical note too. I'm not just going to just get us lost in an ocean of terms and science that doesn't feel useful at all. But it's kind of cool. I love nerding out about this stuff. There's tremendous value to understanding that there is some degree of organization within the nervous system. Even just getting introduced to polyvagal theory, something that's used a lot in counseling, and just getting familiar with your brain, the fact that your brain has these different categorizations. I guess this is a little bit of my own kind of take, but I feel the more you start to engage with the idea that the mind is something that you have control over, the more that you're able to actually bring what I call meta awareness to the mind. So, for example, there are certain brain networks that activate. I might have even brought this up in different podcasts, but your brain engages in certain neural nets and different brain networks when you bring awareness to the fact that you're thinking. When you bring awareness to the fact that you have a brain that is continuously engaging within itself, and it's kind of like compensating and adapting and shifting very, very quickly. And if you start to slow down, in a sense, this is what happens when you meditate or engage within a mindfulness practice. You're starting to allow certain brain networks to relax or go offline. And you're starting to bring awareness to different brain networks that might not be engaged more regularly. So you're actually changing the way your brain is thinking just by bringing awareness to the fact that your mind is this interconnected system. A little bit of neuroscience that I feel is relevant, especially if you do parts work. It's kind of like bringing awareness to parts, in a way bringing awareness to your own thinking process, to the neural nets, starting to consciously shift how your thinking process is impacting the rest of your body and your mind. So where do I want to go with this topic? I want to try to do my best to bang out in about a half hour. I'm going to close the textbook now because I have some notes. But seriously, I want to go into this thing called want and liking theory. And if you want to figure out I apologize if I'm not doing justice to the, I'm not quoting these people properly and not, what's it called? I'm not like giving credit where credit is due in relation to these theories, but you can look up wanting and liking theory, I believe, or it's want and like, I have in my notes, want and liking theory. So you're considering how wanting is kind of like this idea that we're craving the drug. And there's certain neural systems, probably the dopaminergic pathways that are related to the craving of the drug. You want this thing, you're thinking about it, you're starting to kind of maybe visualize, and certain muscle groups might be engaging in a sort of titillated excitement, right? Maybe there's an anticipation that's building, right? That's the wanting for the substance. Maybe you're starting to think about the last time you used it and what your experience was like there, versus liking. Now, this is more connected to endogenous opiate receptors. And this is the pleasure experience. This is the experience of pleasure that the person experiences while they're taking the drug. And there's a very different kind of distinction there between each of these are likely present within someone who's addicted to a substance, but not always. I suppose one or the other is more likely to be prevalent at one point or another, but yeah, you're just considering there's certain neural networks that come online when you're craving to use a substance versus when you're actually considering the pleasure that you are seeking from the experience, and how that activates more of kind of these endogenous opiate receptors, which are more kind of like a pleasure-based drug, And I guess just noticing that I don't have the knowledge of this theory to go in depth, but I was just trying to make that distinction. I wrote the notes on that, so I want to just touch on that. Another thing I found was interesting and noteworthy is they noted in this, based on research, that there's hormonal differences, physical differences as well, right? Based on women's size versus men's size. And we're just using biological men and women. I understand there's a lot of variability within sexual expression and orientation. So biological women, in this case, there's hormonal differences that actually make those individuals twice as sensitive to drugs and drug use. Clearly, this isn't all-encompassing. I don't feel this is speaking to every situation. It's not a definitive conclusion, but it does say how there are hormonal differences in men and women, at least biologically, and just really recognizing how that comes into play in addiction, and how that comes into play in sensitivity to the experience of a drug. So they spoke to a lot of these different stimulant drugs and how those stimulants would be twice as powerful for someone who is biologically woman, as a man, as a male, as biologically male. So then there's this just connection with the process of being addicted to those drugs, also being connected to this, the experience of those substances, and, chasing that certain high, and even something to do with withdrawal, and one's likelihood to return to using drugs would be also doubled in females, biologically females, according to what's written in this textbook, what's based on research. It's not definitive, and I'm sure it's subject to a lot of variability, but I found that was pretty interesting, and it's something I've actually never considered. I've never had that conversation with any of my friends about, hey, do you feel like based on your biological gender, you have more of a sensitivity to drugs, or is that something that's ever really talked about? Probably not. So I just thought that's cool to note. And they've gone on here in this textbook to write that substance abuse is when you're relying on a drug chronically and excessively, occupying a central place in their lives, whereas substance dependence, which is the more, let's just say, developed version of substance abuse, which is also referred to as addiction, where there's a tolerance that's developed, and once you have that tolerance, you might not even be actually experiencing the pleasure of the substance anymore. It's more of just kind of like you're craving, and then you're going to go on to use as a way to quell that craving. And then there's also to avoid withdrawal, which they're more referring to substances that have intense withdrawal, like opiates or heroin or fentanyl. But let's just be real, withdrawal is very complex, and it's often not just a physical experience. Whereas it starts physical, I believe it goes on to become emotional and psychological and behavioral. And yeah, it's important to recognize that you can be dependent on a substance, and there could be a lack of, I'd say, like significant physical withdrawals, but there can be various behavioral withdrawals and emotional and psychological withdrawals. Just to kind of contextualize that with my understanding a little. I've been addicted to things, right? I've been addicted to various substances, and just recognizing that, we're also addicted to things that aren't substances, and it's not going to have the same level of physical withdrawal, but likely a lot of physical or psychological and emotional withdrawal is likely there. What is that line? I guess I'll ask you this, to whomever wants to kind of think about this. What's that line between substance use or abuse? Because there is a line, right? It becomes social use to more problematic use and abuse, and then it becomes dependence, and then it becomes like it's you're subbing it out for something else in your life, and you're escaping the withdrawal and ultimately not feeling the pleasurable effects of that use anymore. So I feel like I don't have a lot I can really add here other than just saying that I'm not an expert when it comes to addiction. I love to learn about this stuff. I have experientially learned a lot, and I do work with people in integrating recovery process. Maybe sometimes there's a little bit of returning to, right? That's part of the recovery process. Can I just speak to that? It's part of the recovery process. Oftentimes it is that you're going to relapse, and you're going to return to some degree of use within a substance. And then just recognizing that if you're able to continue to return to your foundation, your plan, return to your emotional support networks, and create something of a strategy around returning to a point of recovery and a point of abstinence that feels good for you. It's like recognizing that it's not all or nothing. And I think we often do see it as such. It's like you quit indefinitely, there's no wiggle room, and then there's like shame around using again. And that shame can actually be a spiral back into using more. So I just want to recognize that, can we just have more acceptance for what our body's going through and how our mind has actually developed to require that drug physiologically, biologically, like physically our body begins to crave it, and what our brain has done to adapt its neurochemistry to, in a way, require that drug, right? The dopaminergic pathways that are being engaged that have, I would say, evolutionary functions. They have innate purposes, but we're in a sense not utilizing them organically. We're creating a chemical relationship between that dopaminergic pathway and the world around us and the substance and the use of it, the acquiring of it. So it's like just recognizing that stuff doesn't change overnight. That stuff doesn't change over the course of maybe even a few months to a year. It's like, those same pathways have been rewired, and you have to continue to change that same neurological response back to what it was before, but maybe it also might be different moving forward, right? So many things come into play when you consider what's called plasticity. And this is what I'm going to talk about in a moment. I'm going to get into plasticity. I really want to jump into that topic a bit. And I have some pretty good frameworks to refer to from the textbook, but I'm going to probably just riff in whatever I feel I can offer. One of my last notes here I have is about ADHD, medications really, but also just about considering how ADHD, it's kind of like varies, right? Person to person, but something to do with the availability of dopamine just not being there, something to do with the lack of focus and how that's viewed in the academic and mainstream systems as being inattentive or unproductive or less than. And then there's this goal, right? Let's just say the pharmacological intervention using medications. The goal is to get you back to that baseline of focus and productivity and rocking those test scores. So when they refer to ADHD medications, the stimulants, the amphetamines that are typically prescribed, they're essentially increasing the availability of dopamine within these receptor sites, which otherwise wouldn't be binding correctly, or I'm sure there's a lot of different ways to which it's interacting. Let's just say that the dopamine isn't there. It doesn't stay. Maybe it gets activated, but maybe it just doesn't bind properly. Maybe the reuptake system is so overly engaged that the dopamine gets reuptaked, or there's however you would say that word, but the reuptake system just kind of vacuums back up all the dopamine, and you got nothing sitting in those synapses. So yeah, just recognizing that the research they did basically was based on test scores. I'm sure there's been a lot of research, but this was being referred to as the research that they've done over the years in terms of whether ADHD meds are effective. It's basically based on test scores in schools. And they saw that the test scores skyrocketed. No way. People are being given stimulants and they're getting an increased level of dopamine within their system while they're studying and learning and taking tests, of course. Makes sense that their test scores are going to increase. And then this is seen as kind of like the definitive conclusion, right? That based on these test scores increasing, these meds are going to help people with ADHD overall, right, in their lives. That's kind of the very, very quickly summarized sort of conclusion. I'm sure there's a lot more nuance to that, but they also spoke to, and I think this is important to note, how this research isn't actually reliable because many of the participants drop out of these studies, and there's not a long-term conclusion or result. There's not like data of people that have consistently used these medications long-term. So, I mean, that's unfortunate, but that's probably just part of research, right? Maybe it's part of being ADHD. They just kind of fall off the map. They don't want to continue doing the thing. It's harder for them to focus on whatever it is they need them to do to stick with the research, right? And something I want to kind of bring in, and maybe this is me kind of kind of just bolstering my argument a bit. So, take this with a grain of salt, but it says there are potential unknown, they use the word neural, but I'm using neurological side effects. Whatever that might be, whatever that means, really. It's just not researched. They don't know what the long-term effects are on the mind and the functioning of the mind and those dopaminergic systems, the reuptake systems, all of these systems within the brain that are being essentially chemically altered and chemically adapted. There is no real understanding of what that's going to do over the long term. And then, of course, they're referring to this other case if it's being abused, so not used within the, let's just call it the curriculum or routine working with a doctor, having it kind of like, dialed in a certain way. But if it's being abused, they're just kind of like, I'm just going to use these for partying, or I'm just going to use these because I need it right now. And I don't care what my routine says. I need to take this now because I need to study now. Well, common side effects are sleep problems, which I think is just horrible because that's a problem for ADHD people anyway. So furthering those sleep problems, loss of appetite, another just travesty, if you ask me, if you stop eating regularly, and you're certainly going to change your neurochemistry in your body. And headaches, which I'm grateful I don't experience commonly, but if you get headaches, it could potentially lead to some kind of chronic pain, who knows? So in some cases, it says it could also lead to addiction to these stimulants, to these amphetamines, or cardiovascular problems, which is also pretty tragic if you ask me. So anyway, is it worth the risk? I don't know. I did medication. I tried using different types of ADHD meds, sometimes for depression, sometimes for focus. It seemed to work until it didn't. And I'm very grateful that I've not used any types of medications for close to 10 years. And I believe behavioral interventions are most effective, but if you can find a way to apply these medications, they're not all amphetamines, right? If you can find the ones that work for you, and it gives you some kind of stepping stone to helping to curb some sort of, let's just call it dysfunction, or some sort of pattern that you need to get through, awesome. But over the long term, I'd recommend not relying or being dependent upon a medication, especially a stimulant, and just recognizing that that can have long-term physical and neurological symptoms or consequences. So that's my little blurb on ADHD meds. And I'm not for or against them. I am biased towards not using them, but at the same time, I do feel it's important for us to experiment and find out these things ourselves. And yeah, if there is a way that you've been benefiting over the years, I don't want to invalidate that. I really want to recognize that I'm not an expert. And I think there are many people, especially those that study this stuff professionally, that would disagree with any kind of like should or should not statements about this. All right, so I want to take a moment to kind of just like chill out. Yeah, it's a very fascinating topic, talking about addiction and neurochemistry and all that stuff. But I feel there's a really beautiful and important and valuable topic here that I want to give my whole experience the ability to engage with. I don't want it to just be my brain flying through facts. I want to slow down and really speak to this concept of plasticity in the brain. Just the other day, I was doing some journaling and realized just how amazing positive neuroplasticity is what it's referred to as. Just how amazing that concept is, how life-changing it is, how miraculous, you could even say. It's this kind of phenomena of this world that our brain changes, and the ways it change can go on to completely alter our perception of reality. It goes on to become just, I won't say better or worse, but it becomes more attuned and fluid and efficient, really. It's about efficiency for sure. But you can also look to neuroplasticity helping us engage with brain regions that have nothing to do with conventional intelligence. They have to do with creative intelligence. They have to do with spatial and spiritual concepts, awareness, engaging with the default mode network, which we see is relating to this kind of rest state that your brain goes to when it's doing nothing. When you meditate, you engage with the default mode network, and recognizing what happens when you turn off the default mode network, when you start to just like activate these brain regions that have been maybe dormant or very, very slowly idling for basically your entire life. And I do believe the brain is a kind of radio signal for everything. Whether that's just purely in the physical plane, I don't know, I'll leave that up to you. I feel like it's just this antenna that, if attuned and sharpened and expanded and grown, there's basically endless possibilities. And I just want to speak to that as my kind of very non-scientific statement, but I believe it to be true. Yeah, our brain isn't just about the physical world. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot we can say about how the mind develops over the course of our lives. And I just want to offer some maybe basic definitions of plasticity. So it looks at how our brain adapts to our environment. And it does adapt to our environment. And as a result of the way our brain chooses to shift or adapt, our cells within our brain, as well as our cells within our body, they change accordingly. And it's such a widely interesting topic. And I wish I could get into all the nuances of it, but I'm just going to speak to what I have read from this text and maybe some elaborations from there. Looking to how there's this concept, basically how stress plays into the survivability of new cells, newly formed cells, right? Neuroplasticity is basically when older cells die. They're being cued to, they're being signaled and programmed to die. And then these new cells go on to form. And I don't remember all the neurochemicals involved, I apologize, but there are situations where the older cells may not actually die in the way that we want them to or need them to. They could stick around longer than they ought to, quote unquote. And new cells are typically driven by, I think it's called growth factor, like nerve growth factor, brain derived neuro growth factor. There's a couple different terms that basically are these neurochemicals that stimulate cell growth. And there's this idea that stress is one of those things that would actually hamper the growth of these new cells, or even the survival of those new cells as well. So some of the ways that this is clearly outlined are: stress reduces mental efficiency and can actually be correlated with impairing of memory. So think about how, if you're incredibly stressed out, you're cramming for a test, let's just say, and then you try and learn all this information, right? You're trying to not just input or intake knowledge, right? You're trying to actually apply that knowledge, go on to create connections yourself, right? Really, really critically engage with the material. Well, if you're stressed out, it's very unlikely that those nerve endings are becoming strong and strongly reinforced. So there's actually a lack of plasticity going on. There's a lack of those brain grooves being deepened. You're doing the initial thing, and maybe it's firing the initial kind of cue to start the growth of new cells, or strengthen that signal. But over time, if it's not a strongly developed cell, it might just die very quickly. And that's just kind of recognizing how stress can play out. How these things can play out based on stress. I also found there's this really interesting concept called metaplasticity. So we're thinking of neuroplasticity, right? It's how our brain adapts to the environment, how our cells change accordingly, how stress can actually make it harder for our cells to adapt and create new cells and have them survive. But then there's this thing called metaplasticity. So metaplasticity is how experiences over the course of a lifetime interact and go on to shape our mind. So metaplasticity considers how long-term stress interacts with our life experiences, which go on to impact these neuroplastic changes I'm referring to, and then how interactions with drugs, in this case stimulants, but I'm sure any drugs, and then maybe brain injuries we've experienced as a child or maybe go on to experience, and then the nature of our environment where we're learning, the nature of our environment where we're continuing to practice and build these plastic connections. It can be complex. So if you're in a complex environment, that can actually will contribute to how plastic your brain is. So, I mean, there's another thing they consider about how, in this textbook, they consider how plastic changes are time dependent, which makes sense. As a coach, I see this play out all the time. And you consider the difference is actually not as much as you'd think. It's sometimes the difference between 4 days versus 14 days of something consistently actually starts to build that neural connection, and there's a significant increase to the plasticity that's been essentially developing over that time. And I mean, there's also another principle here that points out how our minds change in ways that is related to the level of relevance. So, for instance, if you're learning how to taste a food and decide if it's poisonous or not, that's pretty relevant to us as humans, right? You're eating food and you're deciding whether it's going to kill you. Versus if you're learning a complex theory, they use the example of string theory or theory of relativity. It's like, but even just a psychological theory in school or something, how relevant is that to you, to your survival? How relevant is that to your cellular network that is attempting to create some degree of plastic change in the brain and does so based on a level of, it's assessing its relevancy. So if something feels relevant to you, it's probably not going to be something that you're going to create a strong connection to emotionally or even just within the level of relevance in the mind. And then it's likely that your brain's not going to create plastic connections. So, I mean, I think it's just important to recognize what we're learning. I suppose that's my kind of takeaway from that is it is about consistent exposure to something that, let's just say, we want to learn, and continuing to study it and expose ourselves to it and learn in creative ways and have good teachers. This is important stuff, right? But how relevant is the information that we're intaking to us on a personal level? Maybe to the human experience as well. This example was referring to humans, relevance as a species, but I think it's like as far as your personal relevance, how relevant is this thing that you're learning to your survival? Do you have an emotional motivation? Are you emotionally motivated to learn this thing? Or is it something you're kind of just learning for sake of information? Or is it just something that people, society or whatever tells you you should be learning? Or maybe it's just what's important to know for sake of being competent in your field. And those are all great reasons, but those aren't going to be near as, I'd say, motivating, which in turn goes on to create a degree of how your brain prioritizes plasticity as something that you feel very deeply connected to and feel is highly relevant. It's the priority for you in your life currently. So another thing that's pointed out here is how plasticity is related to the intensity or frequency of experiences. So slower behavioral change reflects slower plastic change. And this is something I spoke to a little bit before, but now I'm just really kind of hammering home is if you're just doing something and it's kind of like everything is the environment around it or the exposure to it, it's kind of chill. There's no real intensity to the experience. There's kind of a lack of frequency in how you're continuing to engage within it. Your brain's ability to wire that is going to be so slow, if even really possible, I would say. So there's almost like a necessity for a certain level of pressure or intensity, and certainly a level of frequency and continuous exposure to something that you're trying to learn. Otherwise, it could take years to learn something that might actually take maybe a few months if you're in the right conditions. So not to put yourself in a situation where you burn out and you're getting exposed to highly stressful conditions. That's like the other extreme, right? Your brain, when it's making these changes and it's encoding neural pathways, it kind of needs that, what's it called, Goldilocks kind of conditions. If things are too stressful, right? If you're hammering too many different commands into the system that is the mind, if you're just overwhelmed by sensory stimuli and dysregulation from other people's nervous systems, that's going to hamper a lot of things, but it's ultimately going to make this plastic change much slower, if at all possible. And then when you find that you're not actually exposing yourself to enough pressure or continuous exposure to the thing you're trying to learn or the stimulus, then that's also additionally just not enough to engage. It's not maybe potentially relevant enough either. So you need to find that sweet spot of what is enough for you, for your mind. And yeah, just recognizing that too much or too little is going to significantly reduce how much your brain actually grows these cells and actually starts to strengthen these networks. They use this quote here: to become an expert requires 1,000,000 repetitions. And I think that's true. However, they also say that in some cases, things can be learned with far less repetitions. And it depends on the task, depends on what you're trying to learn, right? Depends on what is the level of, what is the skill ceiling? What is the, essentially, what is the task and how are you approaching it, right? Are you being trained? Are you being mentored? Are you in an environment that fosters growth? Or are you in an environment where it's just impossible to make space for, I would say, a level of deeper learning? Because you're searching here for deeper learning, and the plastic change comes from that deeper learning. So just recognizing that sometimes it does take many cases, 1,000,000 repetitions of one thing to become a quote unquote expert. That being said, how are you approaching this thing? What's the level of relevance that this thing holds within you each moment that you approach it? And your environment, keeping in mind, what is your environment like? Who are the people in your life that are contributing to that growth? Or are they making it harder for you to actually grow? And are they creating inoptimal conditions for you to learn? All right, so just to end this whole podcast, it's probably gone way over what I wanted it to go. Last principle they bring in here is about how plasticity can be maladaptive. And it certainly can be. Right? We think of it as this beautiful, positive thing, right? Positive neuroplasticity is a good thing. I don't think there is this word, but let's just say negative neuroplasticity is a very bad thing. So some examples here are addiction. They actually connected how long-term addiction actually changes what they call prefrontal morphology. So that's essentially how your prefrontal cortex is actually structured, and what actually consists, what the neural networks and surrounding tissues have gone on to, how they've kind of constructed themselves and how they've gone on to be formatted is essentially completely altered. And no, this isn't permanent, but this is likely something that will be incredibly difficult to rehabilitate. So recognizing that your prefrontal cortex is related to so many different things, particularly higher order thinking, logical thinking, complex problems, problem solving, what we consider conventional intelligence, and focus for the most part. I think there's also other areas that relate to that for sure. But it's like there's a lot of importance to preserving the prefrontal cortex and the frontal lobe. And unfortunately, long-term addiction does cause some changes to that. But recognizing that there is a lot of different ways that you can actually go on to heal that damage or trauma to the brain and the body. And it's not like you're altered forever, but there is just an importance of recognizing that this is how plasticity is becoming maladaptive. It's actually changing your neurochemistry, which is going on to change the brain and the body, and the body's responses to the brain more so. And now pathological pain, I don't know exactly what that is, but I'm kind of taking a guess here. It's probably relating to pain that you experience as the result of pathological conditions like neuropathologies. I don't actually know. Dementia. They're speaking to it being a form of plasticity that's gone maladaptive, become maladaptive. And epilepsy, which is seizures continually. Now, I'll just honestly end with that. I'm not an expert. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't know how some of these connections are being made and what research is around it. I'm just reading from this textbook and recognizing, yeah, there's benefits to positive neuroplasticity, and there's also the brain can be essentially conditioned over time to do things that are actually detrimental to our health and are actually causing further problems within our lives. And I'll end on a good positive note, let's just say, where there are connections here between massage, variety of things, variety of different recovery methods, but one of which was massage and recovering from neurological injuries. And I see that as quite beautiful. Yeah, I see that as, massage is just the example they outlined in the textbook, but I feel like you could go on to generalize this to so many different forms of treatment they're somatic, that work with the body, and just recognizing that the body, in the way that it's healed, it can be from the top down, right? It can be from, so you can consider how when you're healing the brain and the body, it can be done from the level of the mind that extends onto the way the body responds to the mind and the way it's being kind of, let's just say, puppeted or, kind of controlled in a way. And yeah, you can start at the level of the mind, which will go in turn to shift those networks that influence the muscle groups or change the hormonal systems that'll go on to create lasting shifts in the body and change those patterns. Or, other way around, you can start to work with the body at the level of the skin and the facial, the fascia, not just facial, but the fascia, the muscle groups, the skin, the connecting tissues, the bones, of course, and just recognizing that even just something as simple as massage, it's not always that simple, but they were talking about like brushing yourself very gently, can go on to start to work at essentially releasing certain neurochemicals within the brain that they see as being important for healing from different neurological injuries. So it's just amazing the power of the body and the mind to kind of intercommunicate to heal you. And there are so many things that we do that feel subtle, that feel like they're maybe something of, it's an insignificant thing in the bigger picture. But when they're done continually, when they're done consistently, when they're done in a way that I would say is, I guess, like skillfully applied as well. Sometimes you kind of just do something like, I'm just kind of doing a thing. When you do something with a deeper rooted intention, maybe level of skill is involved, you can recognize how this is impacting things on a cellular level. This is starting to trigger something within the mind that releases a certain neurochemical, which goes on to impact the entire system. So I was using the example of massage is one of those things that can go on to actually help support people who have neurological, like physical neurological problems, like injuries. And this can start to, in turn, contribute to the recovery and rehabilitation. I think this can go on to include, Tai Chi and Qigong, yoga, breath work for sure in all the various forms, various holistic modalities. Can't remember them all, but acupuncture for sure, cranial, sacral, therapies, what's it called? Various different treatment methods that deal with the body and support the body, deep tissue massage, chiropractics, of course. So just recognizing that the mind is plastic and everything that we do goes on to impact these complex systems and release different neurochemicals. And there's a kind of homeostasis that the body is continuously in each moment trying to reach. And over the long term, there's a I'd say a more meta homeostatic balance that is trying to be obtained. And each method of recovery that we introduce in some way is helping that homeostatic balance. Yeah, we're all trying to just get some kind of harmony, I suppose. You don't even need to know all this stuff for sake of obtaining that harmony. This is more of the nerding out perspective, or let's just say the level of expertise that you might want if you're getting into the profession of that, that category. Trying to help people and support people, you might want to know some of this back end stuff. I guess like asking yourself why you want to know this information. For me personally, I feel it's important to educate people. I feel it's important to introduce this stuff with my clients if it's relevant, or just to have for my own sake of understanding. How am I biased towards working with clients if I'm considering plasticity and introducing perspectives around addiction, or talking about ADHD and use of medication? So it's kind of like how all these different theories and levels of research actually do go on to shape our mindset in terms of how we show up for a person and how we support them the best, and having maybe a level of transparency about our scope of practice and what it is that we can capably do. And yeah, that's kind of it. Appreciate you joining me today for this long-winded exploration of neuroscience, starting to incorporate elements of plasticity and just kind of looking at the nervous system a little bit. And I hope you have a great rest of your day and afternoon. Maybe leave a 5-star review on my podcast on Spotify. That would be perfect. I'd appreciate it. And yeah, otherwise, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and take care for now. Bye. And if you're interested in working with me one-on-one, please reach out over Instagram, Facebook, or through my email, featheroflightcounseling@outlook.com. I have available slots for counseling. Additionally, I have parts workshops that I'm running each week. So Saturdays at 10 a.m. we'll be meeting this week and each week following, where we can bring in discussions around parts. You can share about things that you're noticing about your parts, and I will offer some education around working with your parts. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Take care. Bye.